je vais poser un amour. Quoi qu'il fasse, quoi qu'il dise, c'est toi et moi, c'est pour l'éternité. Nité pour l'éternité. Nité pour l'éternité. Nité pour l'éternité. Nité pour l'éternité, bébé. Chaque soir je rentrais, j'ai qu'une envie, c'est me coucher. I know, oh, toutes tes mains galop, mais c'est pour nous que je vais travailler. Tu me connais, ne te dis pas que je suis en train de te tromper. Sa grandeur, le roi 12-12. Un cordillon de la clé de l'amour dans un couplet, c'est l'unité. C'est mon bébé, ton âme que comme une parmi côté, tout ce qui compte bébé, c'est nous. Son excellence, Tony Gervais, c'est notre échange d'amour. Gamalé ou tard le soirée, tout aimait. C'est pour nous que je vais poser un amour. Quoi qu'il fasse, quoi qu'il dise, c'est toi et moi, c'est pour l'éternité. Nité pour l'éternité. Nité pour l'éternité. Nité pour l'éternité. Nité pour l'éternité, bébé. C'est pour nous, bébé. Je me bats toujours. Si je t'ai blessé, bébé, pardonne-moi, oh, s'il te plaît. Richard Jovi, le parent des jeunes. J'ai tout fait pour nous, ma commande dans un réel pour nous. J'en pour nous, tout ce que j'ai fait, je l'ai fait pour nous. Aïe, aïe, c'est pour vous, pour nous. Aïe, aïe, c'est pour nous, pour la clé de l'amour dans un couplet, c'est l'unité. C'est mon bébé, ton âme que comme une parmi côté, tout ce qui compte bébé, c'est nous. Son excellence, Tony Gervais, c'est notre échange d'amour.
1968, 2020, 52 years down the road. And so we are celebrating a legacy this day, the 20th of January 2020. Martin Luther King Jr. That's the name that has been on our lips since the start of this 20th day of the first month of 2020. For those of you just joining us, welcome to Apex One Radio. Welcome to this last segment of broadcast, reaching you live from the studio of Apex One Radio, situated at the northern belt of the city of Columbus. We are in the state of Ohio. We are in the city of Columbus, which is, of course, the chief city of this state. We are broadcasting live from the United States of America. If you're just joining us, thank you so much for choosing Apex One Radio. It's been a moderate day here in the city as far as the weather condition was concerned. And it's also been a fantastic start of the week. I hope you're doing great at your own corner of the globe. We are broadcasting live from the USA. And so we're going to have a fresh edition of Apex Snapshots, during which time we will join the world at large and, of course, Americans who live in this country and abroad to commemorate the legacy, or to celebrate the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, so that's what we shall be doing on radio this evening. For now, just listen to this piece of music, then we will be right back to kick off this fresh edition of Snapshots, just on Apex One Radio. At exactly 11 minutes to 8. Do not go away.
L'oreille magique, Julien Guénet, Marlise et Samba Albertine Fouda.
LB King on the track.
This is Apex Snapshot, special edition devoted to the life of a great personality. Martin Luther King Jr. is his name, an activist like we've never had before. His legacy lives on, and today we are on radio to talk about him, to look into his life, to look at the lessons he left behind, and just where we can kick off from this great legacy. If you're ready, then we're ready to go. Marcel Adjun is producing the show from Varswich in Switzerland. My name is Ernest Kanjo. The entire Apex One radio team is monitoring as well. Special Apex snapshots, Martin Luther King forever. Let's go.
There was a man who had a dream. His name was Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King. His name was Martin Luther King. Dr. King, he had a dream of peace and harmony. P-E-A-C-E, 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 of peace and harmony. There was a man who had a dream. His name was Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King. His name was Martin Luther King. His name was Martin Luther King.
The strength of history is such that it leaves an indelible mark on whatever had come its way. Awareness of this fact is the first step towards working hard to shape history. History tells it the way it happened, which means history is a replica of truth. In its display of the truth, therefore, history could be very bitter. Bitter in the sense that if that truth was a negative one, history would tell it as it was, no matter whose toes are stepped upon. Also, no matter how much effort haters of history or those who are scared of it can make to twist or thwart it, history would stand tall and strong and would look at them in the face. With this, an observer once remarked that history is wicked. Wicked because it will harbor your past forever, even when that past was an ugly one. And so, shaping history is a task that can only be performed today. If you want to be on the good side of history, start making it today. If you decide to mar instead of making it, you would face history tomorrow, and its blows may be too deadly to withstand. For some people, they worked hard and got placed on the good side of history. They did so by their deeds, which created indelible impacts on their communities and society at large. Now, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 100 years down the road, history still smiles with them. Their legacies stand tall and are being celebrated year in, year out. Martin Luther King Jr. falls within this category of people who are in good books of history, having fought a genuine and noble fight. Today, known as the father of civil rights movements, which was rife in the 50s and 60s, King put up an enviable posture in the struggle against what historians describe as one of the worst crimes against humanity, that is racism. His approach, as bookmakers put it, was exceptional, given that he opted for nonviolence in his struggle against this social ill. His activism and activities were so beautifully packaged that they have stayed around in memories forever. His famous August the 28th, 1963, I Have a Dream speech sounds like a piece of music which is timeless and universal. Until date, the mention of that masterpiece, delivered at the March on Washington, D.C., where over 250,000 people showed up that fateful day in August of 63, moves you from your seat. And even when King was assassinated in 68, he lives on just like artists who never die. 52 years on, the world is still celebrating what this commentator would describe as a life full of meaning, that of Martin Luther King Jr. And just like in the past, today is another such day put aside to commemorate this hero. Who was Martin Luther King? What did he do? What were his famous outings? What does Martin Luther King represent within the African American community? What lessons did his life teach African Americans, Americans as a whole, and the world at large? This and more are some of the questions we will be asking ourselves in this special edition of Apex Snapshot, reaching you live from Apex One Radio. And so, welcome on board this special edition of the show. It's 4 minutes to 8 here in the studio, and the show is produced from Switzerland, precisely in the city of Valsuch by Marcel Adjan, and hosted here in the studio by Ernest Kanjo. I will be back to introduce my guests on the show tonight. Martin Luther King Jr. forever. Let's ride on with music. We'll be right back.
Dr. King, he had a dream of peace and harmony. P-E-A-C-E, 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 of peace and harmony.
I was having a dream. I was whipping a Rolls Royce, and I bought everything that I want. Turned the Martin Luther King overnight. Martin Luther King overnight. I was dead broke, hustling on the steps.
Welcome back to the studio of Apex One Radio. If you're just joining us, you are welcome to this special edition of Apex Snapshots, reaching you live from the studio of Apex One Radio, situated at the northern belt of Columbus. All right, so like we've said earlier, this show is focusing on Martin Luther King Jr., whose memory is being commemorated today, the 20th of January 2020. It's a holiday in the United States of America, and Americans and the rest of the world have taken this day to think, to reflect on the life of this great personality who is being celebrated even after half a decade since he left the stage. My guest tonight will be joining me to discuss this great gentleman, Martin Luther King, of course. And so, to my extreme left, I have Latina Humphrey. How are you today?
I am fine. How about yourself?
I'm great. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How is everything treating you today?
Everything is super good, and I'm super excited and elated to be here today. Can I go ahead and introduce myself?
Just do that.
All right. So, like you said, my name is Latina Humphrey.
Mm-hmm.
I currently serve as the first female president of Central Ohio Young Black Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
I am a speaker, and I am also an author. And again, just super elated and privileged to be here with you all today. So, thank you.
Beautiful. Thank God we have a speaker in the studio today. Martin Luther King Jr. was one himself, and who will be diagnosing the life of MLK on the show today. Don Tavius Janel is not new to the studio of Apex One. He's been here before. He came here for the first time as a politician running for office. We'll not be talking about that today. We'll be focusing on Martin Luther King Jr. How are you doing today?
You know, I'm blessed. You know, when I think about today and what today means, not just for myself, but for so many members of the community across the diaspora. I'm happy to be here, and thank you to Apex for, again, being on the forefront to have these types of conversations. So
beautiful. I'll begin with Latina. Now, tell me, when did you first learn about Dr. Martin Luther King?
So I learned about Dr. King in, I believe it was 5th grade. I was sitting in a classroom. I went to Southwestern City Schools. And I had always known about him, but when he stuck out the most to me was when I was sitting in the classroom and it was Black History Month, it was February, and the teacher was like, okay, so now we have to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King. And all the kids was like, oh my God, we always talk about him, we always discuss him. And the teacher was like, I know, but you know, we just gotta get through it. And for me, when they said that, it burnt, like I had a fire in my soul, because I understood my mom had just bought her first house, and we lived in a predominantly white neighborhood, and so I understood that if it had not been for Martin Luther King, my mama wouldn't have been able to buy a house in Grove City. And so it was then that I understood the importance of Dr. King, and it was of disrespect for the teacher to allow that conversation to go on and not correct it. But that's when I knew that Dr. King was important, and it continued to just be in my soul. So that's when I really started to really try to even learn more about him.
Tell me, had you known about Dr. King before you went to school?
You know, my parents were, my mother, she would always also talk about, you know, all of the civil rights heroes and sheroes. And I think about my grandmother, who also, you know, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. And I was lucky because my grandmother, growing up, she used to cook for many of the prominent faith leaders in Cleveland. And so I remember kind of talking to her about experiences and encounters she's had with many of these individuals. In fact, you know, we always see individuals through a particular rose-colored lens, but my grandmother really had an opportunity to see them live in real full picture, and could give me perspective. And so she remembered, you know, I remember telling her telling me about, you know, Martin Luther King and when he came to Cleveland, and some of the other pastors and leaders, and how they acted, how they exemplified themselves in light of the struggle. And so that was my first kind of foray into the understanding who MLK was. You know, and then it only became more prominent as I went to school. And unfortunately, we lost some of those other civil rights leaders who also were behind Martin Luther King, as I only heard about and talked about and spoke about MLK in my class. And so I think for me, having my grandmother there to kind of provide some context to the struggle, it only amplified my connection to MLK and all the other civil rights leaders who've come to before me. So
right, and so King was a civil activist whose struggle, you know, centered mostly around racism.
Yeah,
I would have been asking this question to people who live in the other generation, not yours, but since you guys are in politics and have read, you know, what happened in the past, I'd like to find out, how serious was racism at that time? Was it a big problem per se?
In what? I just want to clarify. So in terms of racism, back then
when he was fighting against it.
Oh, it was incredibly difficult. I mean, when you think about, you know, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we had the Voting Rights Act of 1965. When you think about where, you know, there were literal families being burned in homes because the KKK were throwing Motel bombs inside their, you know, into churches, and so the, you know, being hosed and being you know, beat, and, you know, having dogs chase you down the street, you know, the fact that people were being killed for very just things that were just like unbelievable. I had a chance to go, and I'm gonna pivot just for 2 seconds. I had a chance to go to the lynching memorial in Alabama, and if you ever go there, it's in Birmingham, and there are stories of families who've been lynched. And if folks don't know what lynching is, it's essentially, not to get too graphic, essentially is basically tarred and feathered, and folks are being shot, they're hung by a tree, and other things have unfortunately been castrated. All types of, mutilations of bodies, everything that you can think of that can go wrong and to hurt someone before they die is done to these individuals. And there were letters, literally, of reasons why these folks were lynched. One which was somebody got a bill wrong, and the black man corrected a white man to saying that you gave me the wrong amount of money, and I need to get my other, the remaining cost that you owed me. And then literally a community came out and lynched him and his family. And so when I think about the impact of what Dr. King and so many others had to persist through in order to get to where we are today, I owe all gratitude to them, and I stand on their shoulders, because I know, while I was not in those spaces, the fact that I can read about even people that we don't even talk about today who died to make my life real, and the fact that I'm doing everything I can do, I owe an immense amount of debt to them. So racism was incredibly real back in that day.
Latino, I'd like you to look at this with me. Before Dr. King rose in the late 50s, racism had been existing. But then, why was the black community silent about it? Did it have to only take his rise, for this social ill to be fought against?
So I think I'm understanding you correctly, but I think that the reason being is because I think African Americans in that time, I think they were scared. So I think that they were, if I'm answering your question correctly, I think that they were scared because of the retaliation, right? Like Dontavius said, because it didn't just start in the 60s, and it didn't just start in the 50s, but it had been going on. Right. But when we say it had been going on, that means every single day people have been traumatized, right? By lynchings, by house bombings, by, just being beat, just being really just mistreated. And so I would say the reason why African Americans weren't as vocal was really because they were scared. And so thank God for Dr. Martin Luther King, who came to prominence, like you said, in the late 50s, 1955, specifically with the Rosa Parks thing, to be able to, stand up and stand tall with those situations with the help of other civil rights leaders. But again, just to answer that question, it was because of fear. And like I said, every day being traumatized. This wasn't new to them. And it was almost like they were becoming used to it. And there was no change. They didn't see any change coming about. And so, like I said, thank God for Dr. Martin Luther King, and thank God for him being the strategist that he was, because he utilized people being beaten and being hurt to put it on national television so that way these things could be corrected. But it was being traumatized and just becoming a norm.
Can I add on to that?
Oh, go ahead.
When I think about the systemic realities that black people have faced for generations, particularly when you go all the way back to slavery, and now from slavery to, unfortunately, now seeing laws and regulations and even my identity as an African American who was stripped away from my own community, from Africa, from countries across Africa, to be sent here to America, or at least my generation, and then to be, basically sold as cattle. And to be, they used to, and my grandmother would tell me these stories because, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother were sharecroppers. And they would tell stories of how they would beat the strongest man in the plantation to signal to the other African-American leaders, or maybe the folks who were, who wanted to resist, who wanted to fight back, that they broke them down through suffering, right? Not giving them food, raping their their wives, mutilating them, castrating them. All types of things were done. Horrific crimes against people were done. And so, to Latina's point, that fear was systemic, because essentially what we were taught during that time was that if you did talk, the likelihood of you being killed was very real, and that was a very present danger, because you're leaving behind family, right? Kids, mothers, daughters, grandmothers, and you wanted to be there for them. And so the ultimate perspective, and again, people did rise up against it and say, regardless of what happens to me, I'm still going to fight. But the fact that it was so systemic is the reason why, we had to figure out a way. We had to build some bridges out of this space, or we would still be trapped in the realities of what my ancestors were going through. So fear played an incredible role in helping people keeping people down, and I think that's something that we just have to recognize and know that the system, even today, is still keeping people down and is still building that type of fear. And we got to do everything we can collectively to work on against that.
The life of Martin Luther King Jr. He is the father of civil rights activism, as it's clearly put. And 52 years down the road, 52 years after he left the stage, he's still being talked about. That tells you just how much he put in. And so, this is Apex One Radio. If you're just joining us, welcome on board Apex Snapshot. It's exactly 11 minutes past 8. Now, Martin Luther King was coming from a Christian background, perhaps the reason why his activism took a very non-violent approach. But I would like to find out the role of the church in the fight against this. We don't hear much about the church, but we hear about a pastor who was fighting against racism. So what was the church's own role?
So for me, and I'll let Dontavius take the rest of this, but for me, how I see it is the church's role was to essentially, especially in that time, or in the time of Dr. Martin Luther King, when he rose to that fame, was, I would say, for voter registration, right? To get people to register to vote, to take them to their voter locations and find out whether or not they could, vote or not. And so I think that the church is really a pillar. But I also want to add that I think it is incumbent upon the leader as to how important the church is in the movement. Because you have to understand that a lot of churches and pastors at that time, outside of Dr. Martin Luther King, didn't always agree with Dr. Martin Luther King. So they might have wanted to keep politics or voter registration or voting separate from Jesus. Or, they wanted to kind of keep it separated. And so I think that the church it has an important role in civil rights. And most times it does, because you have your Andrew Youngs, you have, your Reverend Ralph D. Abernathy. You have those people, Jesse Jackson. Those things, it's important, but it's incumbent upon the leader as to whether or not the church has a place in civil rights. Because a lot of them didn't always agree with Dr. Martin Luther King.
So I'll just add, when you think about December 5th, 1955, the Montgomery Improvement Association, they held their meeting. It was right in the heart of, right after Rosa Parks had been arrested for sitting down and basically saying that I'm not giving up my seat. This association came together to say we need to put together a nonviolent protest to begin to desegregate the busing. And, when I think about, in Montgomery, so when I think about, the role of churches, those were where the meetings were being had. When I think about, we just came from an event not too long ago where Dr. R.A. Vernon was speaking about, as a pastor himself of the Word Church in Cleveland, how the church and pastors of the churches have a duty to speak truth to light and have a calling to, in a way, he talked about politicians versus pastors or people in faith. Like, people in faith, they don't have to be vexed by compromise, right? They can speak up and speak out on things that are important, that are issues of struggle for the communities in which they pastor, and also not be afraid of the consequences because they know that their faith is going to keep them safe, and even in spite of their safety, they know that the truth and God's truth is going to prevail. And so, so I think about churches playing a role in really spearheading these real opportunities to impact change, especially when it's hard. You know, politicians or people within the political spaces sometimes don't really, they have to straddle a lot of worlds, because you have people who, you know, want them to go one way or another, and you're afraid you may lose your job, right? And so folks may not step up in a way that that they should, but pastors have an important role and have played an important role in pushing the narrative in pursuit of justice and creating opportunities where people can truly find a space to impact and fight against many of these injustices.
But again, I think it's still just contingent upon that leader.
Correct.
Because some of them, they don't want to do that. They will leave that for a quote-unquote politician.
That's true.
So I think it's important to clarify.
Absolutely.
This is Apex One Radio. This is Snapshot, special edition reaching you live from the city of Columbus in the United States of America. And so, Mike, Martin Luther King had a series of events that marked his civil activism project in the years which he, in the years which he was active. And one of them, like our guest just mentioned a while ago, is the Montgomery bus boycott that took place in '57.
Yep.
And this was a social protest against the policy of racial segregation on the public transport system of Montgomery in Alabama. It was a seminal event in the civil rights movement. The campaign lasted from December 5 of 1955. That was the Monday after Rosa Parks. An African-American woman was arrested for refusing to surrender her seat to a white person. To December the 20th, 1956, so almost 1 year, of course, when the federal ruling took effect and led to the United States Supreme Court's decision declaring the Alabama and Montgomery laws that segregated buses as unconstitutional. I begin to wonder how this happened, and I want to find out from you if that environment, the bus, could be a veritable place of segregation. I mean, do people experience racism in a bus?
I mean, you know, it's. I'll tell you, you know, you would be surprised how much systemic racism there is across every facet of the workplace, of transportation, you know, even till today, you know, the disparity that exists between individuals who have, you know, lead-free homes versus those who do, you know, who don't, who do. You know, I look at what's happening in Flint, and even what's happening in Cleveland, and even places of Columbus. You know, there is disparity everywhere. And so, to your question, you know, is it, you know, the why or like how, you know, why is this just prevalent in, you know, of all things, busing, like just sitting, you all are moving in the same, you're going the same direction, you're going home, or you're going to business, you're going to work.
Right.
And the fact that, you know, we have built racist, systemically oppressive rules and laws in cities and counties and states, you know, the fact that we had to stand up and fight against that is just, you know, you would think that, wow, like, what was happening during that time? But we know what was happening, right? We know that there was, you know, this is a continuation of the system playing and doing, you know, like folks creating laws because folks didn't feel that I was fully a human, right? There are individuals who, you know, like that devaluation of black bodies was real, and And so, yes, I mean, it was very pervasive. It was everywhere.
We'll come back to you, Dr. Rose. We have somebody on the line who is joining us from the east side of Columbus. Donella is an activist herself, and she is one of those who has, followed the parcours of Martin Luther King. Donella, welcome to the show.
Hi, everyone.
How are you today, Donella?
Great.
Okay. So, Donella, we're talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the occasion of the celebration of his legacy today across the world. First question, how did you learn about Dr. Martin Luther King? Was it in school or before you went to school?
Oh, wow. I can't remember, but I know, like, Dr. King's presence in the Black community is tremendous. I mean, I remember growing up in my grandmother's home, there was a picture of Jesus, and next to that picture was a picture of Dr. King and his wife, Coretta Scott King. Mm-hmm. So literally it was very common to have the Black people to have a picture of Jesus and then have Dr. King next to it.
Mm-hmm. I understand that you have activism reflexes in you. In fact, I've had to call you an activist as well. So tell me, were you in any way inspired by the works of Martin Luther King?
Absolutely. I think, growing up and just learning about him, he really, really just definitely felt like a Christ-like figure. Mm-hmm. And, when I would think about his accomplishments, graduating high school, I think he graduated high school at 15, and I think he had a college degree by the time he was 18, mm-hmm. and had received a doctorate, in his early 20s. Just those accomplishments alone, it just seemed like as a young person, he was just destined to be very special, and his conscientiousness was deeply moving to me, and I think all young people. He wasn't really like a human. He wasn't seen as a person. He really was seen as a Christ-like figure.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell me, what lessons do you think the African-American community and even the United States of America should learn from King's legacy?
Well, I think kind of what we're learning now is that his legacy is complex, mm-hmm. because what he was portrayed as was really, like I said, not even like a human, just this perfect person who, was completely peaceful and, and did not see color, and, sort of like his legacy has been so sanitized that, I think now there's more truths coming out, and that he did understand, the movements, like the Nation of Islam, mm-hmm. and things like that. He did understand, the need for Black people to assert themselves economically, as well as, fight for integration. And a lot of things have come out, too, about how persecuted he was, by the FBI. And, even I believe Reverend Abernathy, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, if that's not the right name, but he came out with a book, I think in the 90s, kind of slandering Dr. King, accusing Dr. King of being a philanderer and this and that. So his legacy has been made more complex in that he was not just this Christ-like figure, but he also was a complex human being that understood, the politics, and knew that for Black people to achieve economic independence, it was going to be much more was needed besides marching. Mm-hmm. But he revolutionized protest, because at that time, the idea of marching and boycotting was not really widespread. And so what he and what so many people did at that time, they really, really taught, the world how to protest and how to effectively make their voices heard.
Now, my last question would be this: if Martin Luther King were to return today, would he be happy with the United States of America we have today?
Well, I think absolutely. Wow. I don't know. I think I think that once again Dr. King would understand the complexities of American history, American politics, and he probably would would thoroughly understand. I don't think America was so different, during his time. I think, people don't change. Times change, but people don't change. And the complexities of, politics don't change. And I think he had a deep understanding of that. I don't think he would be very disappointed in America today because it's the same America that it was, 50 years ago, pretty much.
Okay. Now, Donella, tell me, how do you celebrate this day? How do you usually celebrate it? Do you just sit back at home and reflect, or you organize some activities?
Look, sadly, yes. Sadly, yes. I would like to say, well, I go out and, feed the homeless, or I attend, an MLK dinner or things like that. But no, I have to be honest. I haven't, done any outward shows of, this special day. But it certainly doesn't minimize the effect or the impact of Dr. King's legacy on my heart. It's firmly imprinted on my heart and my consciousness. And I only hope that my daughter will understand his legacy and feel that love for him as well.
Donella, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the show. I do have a fantastic rest of the evening.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy for the invite and to, to say a few words. And thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye for now. And have a fantastic rest of the day. This is Apex Snapshot on Apex One Radio special edition that focuses on the life of a great civil activist. And one of his outings, which have actually stayed around forever, is the march on Washington, D.C., which took place on the 28th of August, 1963. And we are told that over 250,000 people came out, to protest against the lack of jobs for black people, and it was during that occasion that he made his very famous "I Have a Dream" speech. My question would be this: why do you think a huge number of people were mobilized for that particular march?
Wait, say that one more time.
Why was a very huge? Why did people come out en masse for that particular march? Why did so many people come out for that march?
Yeah, really, it was a march on the injustices Black people were facing during that time, and people were sick and tired of being sick and tired. And what better way to show a force for change than to march on the very steps, the very land that slaves built huge monuments in homage to this great country. And so I think about that, that at that time people wanted to see something different.
Okay.
And we all, well, not we, but my ancestors went out and they fought and they marched and they protested for what was right for them. And so that was the importance of it, because it really was. They were dire times. Folks couldn't even get jobs based upon how your name sounds. Even still today, folks can't get jobs based upon how your name sounds. But the fact that there was systemic racism and prejudice keeping people from getting meaningful work was something that needed to be marched on and protested about.
Let me find out this from you. You are a politician. I want to know the importance of protest marches in a democracy. Most often than not, we see, people coming out to protest, but it looks like they do that all the time, but things don't just change rapidly. So what is the role of these marches in a democracy?
So what I will say is protesting, and I talked about this when I was in Philadelphia a couple months ago, protesting is important, right? But what I think that we have forgotten to do is the work afterwards. So protesting is important because what we learned from Dr. King is that he, like I said earlier, was a strategist. Everything that he did was strategic. From the protesters, stand-ins, sit-downs, everything he did was strategic. But what he also did is he went back and he did the work. What we need to understand is that he had the ears of Lyndon Baines Johnson, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And so he could go in, he could say, hey, we did this protest. These are the issues. What are you going to do about it? So what we are seeing right now is people are protesting and then they're going home. They're going back home. And they're saying, okay, so I feel good and that was cute. And now I can go on back to where I come from.
So it's a psychological thing.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So it's a psychological thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a psychological thing because what people want to say is I did it. You can't, what they want to say is, what I found about some folks is they want to say I did it and you got a picture of it and that's that. And so I think that we have to learn what accountability is. And so, yes, I'm going to protest, but then I'm also going to call my elected officials. I'm going to send them emails. I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make sure that they are hearing the concerns that I have. And let's not just reach out to our elected officials on the other side, but also the elected officials that we see every day, because they need to know the issues that we go through, right? But protesting is nice. It's good. It's cute. It's strategy. Dr. King was a strategist. He was good with that. Let's put it on TV so white America can see what we going through for real, so they can see how we being beat in the head, right? But then, like I said, it was on TV, and he also had the ears of Lyndon Baines Johnson, so he could go and say, hey, you saw that. This is not just something I made up. This is not something that I just dreamt up one day and it's just what it was. No, this is happening, so help me. So we got to learn how to hold ourselves accountable as well as holding our elected officials accountable and learn how to do the work. And also, I want to add this, and I know he wants to go, but also with doing the work, it also means organizing, right? That's what that means. That means I'm going to go door to door and make sure that people and see what their issues are. Because we can protest all day long, but if we don't really know the needs, we can look at the overview of what people need. But if we don't know the needs of our neighbors, then we can't. Protesting is cute, but it's not the end all.
Okay. Okay.
I would just add, I think that there are multiple facets for mobilization and change, right? You need people who are policy leadership. You need people who are elected. You need people who are shaking the cage. I won't say the cage, but the fighting and banging on the door, saying that we need change now. And I think that there's importance in the entire continuum. And I think one of the things that we lack, and I don't say this just as a African American, I see this as a diaspora in America. One of the things we lack is a clear understanding of the continuum and how we all play a role in system change and how every part of that process is important. And it's almost like having a three-legged stool, and you taking one of the legs out. Well, at any point, if you take any of those other legs out, that stool won't stand. And so, having the ability, and I think protesting is important because it does provide a vehicle for folks to wake up and say, one, the injustice is real and it's happening not to people that look like me. And then two, there are people who are willing to stand and risk everything in order to fight for what's right. So protesting is important, but as Latina talked about, the continuum for policy and social change needs to be there. You need to have a plan. That's why the association back in '55, when they were doing all of for the bus boycott in Montgomery, it wasn't just the protests, right? It was a multilateral strategic plan where at the end of it, they were being hit from every angle. From the political, from the policy, because people were saying that it wasn't right, from the protesting, from the hitting those pockets. Every angle you can think of, people were being shown that this was an injustice. And in order to rid the reality that people were experiencing at that time, they had to make something right. And that's what we have to do and continue to do today and moving forward.
Okay, this is Apex Snapshot on Apex One Radio. In something like 10 minutes, we should be rounding off this very special yet snappy show that focuses on Martin Luther King. Now, I want us to come back to the I Have a Dream speech, which is still being referenced, half a decade after it was delivered on the 28th of August 1963. There's this section of that speech which has caught my attention. He actually began the speech by making reference to the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed millions of slaves in 1863. So he was making that speech 100 years after the proclamation to free slaves. And so this is what he said. 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
Yeah.
Now, when you listen to that, how does that make you feel? Latina,
I'll
begin with you.
Okay. That's going to be a collective, and I'll let Dontavius close that out. But it's still true.
Is it scary?
Okay. So the thing is it's still true today, right? And that's why it's so impactful. We still feel that when we look at redlining, we know that, Columbus, Ohio is still ranked number 2 as far as racially segregated city. Neighborhoods over here are black, neighborhoods over here are white and wealthy. It's still real. When we look at the prison system, we see how many black folks are locked up. Black and brown people are still locked up. When we see the things that are happening in Mississippi right now, the inhumane conditions in the prison. I mean, I know you in prison, but you ain't got to live like that. So when we think about 100 years later and we're not free, and then we look back another, 53 years, and we're still not free. We're still fighting the same issues that we were fighting before. Affordable housing. Back then there wasn't no housing. Now we can't even afford to live in housing because economic instability, economic disparities. Black women in comparison to white men make 65 cents on the dollar. White women make 75 cents. Brown women make 59 cents. That's an issue. We're still fighting the same fight. Again, black men locked in cages.
So in 48 years, it will be another 100 years, after that proclamation.
Oh, okay.
Do you fear? Are you scared that 48 years from now, this same statement would still be made?
Still be living true. So 48 from now,
Come closer to the microphone, please.
So 48 from now, I'll be in my 70. I hope to God that we would have made strides. That is not to say in the slightest that I know that there are, as Martin Luther King said, there will be mountains to climb. But I know that promised land he talked about in his speech, I've been to the mountaintop, is attainable. Mm-hmm. I think it requires us to be diligent in the realities of now, and to know that the problems that we're facing today are problems that have permeated time in generations, and until we begin to deconstruct the system as it is today, we are going to continually see the resurgence of prejudice and racism in the system that we have. So to answer your question directly, I hope not. I hope that there are young leaders who are standing up today. I mean, one, leadership is, I'm thinking about 13, 14, 12, 11, 8-year-olds who are beginning to wake up and say, this is not the type of world that I want to grow up in. And so I think because of the realities of now, young people are standing up Folks are waking up. People are saying enough's enough. And I think what I also see is a transformation of other communities beyond race and ethnicity, saying that we are tired of seeing these realities, because if it's happening to them, it can happen to us. And so my hope, and based upon what I've known and where we are, I know gradual progress may not feel like progress, but I know, at least I hope, 48 years from now, we will be at a better place as a society than we are today. But we have a lot of work to do. Okay. And until we do something, until we begin to right these systemic barriers and realities and challenges of our system, we're going to continually face these insurmountable challenges.
Beautiful. So the last 5 minutes of the show, we'll be looking at lessons learned from this great legacy, especially within the African American community from where Martin Luther King hailed. This is Apex Snapshots. We're going to take a musical break. When we come back, we will be doing the last phase of the show. This is Apex One Radio. This is Snapshot, the edition of the 20th of January 2020. We're focusing on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And with my guests, we will be looking at what he has left behind, what we've tapped from his legacy, and just how we can use it to make not only America, but then the entire world a very great place to live in. So, quickly, just tell me, how is Martin Luther King regarded in your community today? Is he a hero?
Dr. Martin Luther King, like Dontavia said, Dr. Martin Luther King is a hero. Dr. Martin Luther King is the mere reason why I do what I do. Why my son, if he knows about civil rights leaders, but he knows specifically about Dr. Martin Luther King. And I think when I looked at my timeline today, even people who you wouldn't have thought would have recognized and commended Dr. King, they have, because like he said, we got many things or many places that we have to go and many mountains that we have to climb, but we do understand that we climbed a mighty long way specifically because of Dr. Martin Luther King in the helps of others.
How much of Martin Luther King is being taught in schools today?
How much taught in schools?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely not enough. I will say that I think we sometimes sanitize the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, and I think we have to be. And a part of that is there's probably fear. There's a whole host of things that we don't probably have time to go down into. But I think one of the things we have to do is speak truth to power about what really happened. Many of the I would say young people don't recognize the cost to being in the movement. You know, there are people were killed, families were again, homes were burned down, businesses were closed, folks didn't have peace. They may have went to have addiction issues or mental health issues, and there was a cost to being a part of the movement. And I don't think young kids today don't really understand the full gravity of what was needed and necessary, and what cost people actually endured in order to make even the semblance of change that we see today possible. Okay. And so, to your point, or to your question directly, there's some education, but we have to stop sanitizing what happened in the civil rights movement. We got to really talk about it.
If we look at the African American community today, can we find replicas of Martin Luther King?
Yeah, I would be remiss if I said that we couldn't. I think, like the lady said that called in Donetta, she advised that he was a very complex person. right? And so, like, we need to understand that there are many different people in many different spaces. You have your activists, you have your policy makers, like Dontavia said, you have your speakers like me to make people think about what are you really doing. You have your other leaders, you have your elected officials. There are so many people in so many different spaces that, you know, and young people, that there are replicas of him. But I do challenge people, especially that want to be a Martin Luther King, to really think about the cost and really put that benefit out and put that action to work. Because I think, like I said, a lot of times people get scared because they don't really understand, or they do understand what comes with being a leader and what comes with being in front. So what comes with being in front means you're going to be attacked. It means you're going to be talked about. It means that you're going to be, you know, ostracized and criticized. And so, yeah, there's replicas, but I think people stop in certain places because they're afraid of what comes with being a Dr. Martin Luther King. We've seen what happened in 1967, and we've seen what came with 1968, 23% approval rating.
Beautiful.
And nobody wants that.
I would have loved to put this question to a political science scholar, but then let me just go ahead and ask you.
Yeah.
If Martin Luther King were to operate in today's society, today's digital world, would he put up the same performance as he did in the 60s?
When you say put up the same performance, you mean have the same impact?
Right.
I would believe so. He was an incredible orator, incredible strategic. Him and his the other civil rights leaders were incredibly strategic in mobilization. I think there's, you know, we have folks who are experts in mobilization and didn't go through 5% of what Martin Luther King had to endure. And the fact that they did that without cell phones, without online, without Twitter or Facebook, or, you know, the fact that they had hundreds of thousands of people march on Washington, the fact that they had building a poor people's movement without any of the future technologies that we have today, it speaks volumes of the man and of the movement. And so, yes, I under 100%, I think he will be an incredible organizer with every digital technological device that we have now.
Beautiful. If there is one big lesson you think that his legacy has taught us, what would that be?
Oh, man. Wow, that's a good question. I think that it is by any means necessary. Now, specifically because he was strategic and how he did certain things. He put his life on the line, and let's be quite frank, other people's lives were on the line to prove something to the people in power, so that way we could make change for other people. And so I think what we need to understand about his legacy was he sacrificed. And not a lot of people are willing to sacrifice because it costs too much. And so we need to understand that he sacrificed for our lives every single day. We would not be sitting here talking today in this wonderful studio if it had not been for the works of Dr. Martin Luther King. So understand that he sacrificed a lot.
Beautiful. You both are just coming back from an event to commemorate this day. What was it all about?
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole series of events. You know, you had a breakfast this morning. You had the King Arts Complex had their annual MLK fair and a series of events. We did a march at East High School, and that ended with a evening conversation or evening series of keynotes and speakers. Dr. R.A. Vernon was the keynote speaker for the evening event. So when it comes, you know, so today was a pretty jam-packed day, and there was a lot of beautiful hues of blackness that were in in these spaces commemorating what is an icon and a change maker and a trendsetter for our community. And so it was a beautiful day.
Okay. That's good. So we're about to run off this edition of the show. We'll probably just have one last word from both of you, then that will be it. So if you have an advice to not just African Americans, but to Americans in general, vis-a-vis the life of this man, what would that be?
I would say that to everyone, read Read on your history. Read on people like Dr. Martin Luther King. Read on your Ralph Abernathy's. Read on your Andrew Youngs. Read, learn. Documentaries are really key. I mean, if you really want to understand the civil rights movement, because like he said, the civil rights movement has been sanitized. And so if we're not getting the information that we need, if we don't understand that Dr. King had a set of investors like your Harry Belafonte's and your Lena Hornes, so that way when they went to go protest, those were the people who bailed them out of jail, and people don't understand that. Right. We need to understand the real history. So I would urge other people, black, white, whatever, read your books, listen to documentaries, listen to other intellectuals, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, listen to those people so that you can really understand what civil rights is, and not just what you see on TV, and not just what your teachers teach you. So read as much as you can.
Would you urge people to read as well?
I would, I think, and I was just thinking about this, and I wrote some things down. Life's most persistent question is, what are you doing for others? And I think Martin Luther King brought that into the forefront in a powerful way. He put his life on the line and ultimately was assassinated in the spirit of what are you doing for others? And so when I think about his legacy and what it means to me and what it means to our community, it's really about how do we come together? How do we build a space where all of us are included in the dream that and not just the dream, but in the idea that, this country was developed and built on the backs of slaves. And when I think about prosperity should be inclusive of communities, African American communities, from beginning to end, from birth to death. And in order to get to that space where we are truly a part of the American dream, it's going to require a comprehensive look where we're all at the table, our activists, our politicians, our community leaders, our faith leaders, our business folks, our funders, all of us sitting together and creating a Black agenda that is truly reflective of the beauty of America and the beauty of our people and where we need to go. And so Martin Luther King is shown a blueprint of what can be. It is our job to take that blueprint, amplify it, transform it, and build on it, because we are going to stand on his shoulders for generations to come.
It's our job to take Martin Luther King's blueprint, amplify it, work on it, and transform our country into a better place. That is how we put a full stop to this edition of Apex Snapshots on Apex One Resist. Always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Dontavious.
I'm glad to be back.
Thank you so much, Latina. We hope to have you back on Apex One Radio.
Thank you.
Okay, both of you do have a fantastic evening. And to you out there, I want to thank you so much for having been with us throughout this edition of Snapshots. Thank you once again. Do have a fantastic rest of the evening. And hopefully we will be back here next year to do this same show on this same man and this same legacy. And until we meet, it's bye-bye and may God bless you.